have the privilege of going last and hopefully not repeating everything that all of the speakers have already said, and I will do my very best here. You might notice that I put a 5 up here. So if people have heard me talk before and always know that I put up my 5 fingers because that's about all I can remember. But this talk today is for me to talk about 5 things, but actually for you to walk out of here and think about what are the 5 things you want to do differently about metadata after you've heard all of our talks here. So not just mine, but everyone's. So a little bit about me. As Christine said, I am the Executive Director of Chorus, but before that, and continuing to be that, I am a metadata and persistent identifier wonk. I've been involved with industry standards really since 1999 with Crossref and DOI, and then later on with ORCID and so forth. But let's get into it. So you heard some of the speakers talk about how many policies there are out there from funders. Well, actually, there's data about that, right? So RoarMap is a great example of that. And RoarMap talks about 886 access policies that need to be tracked. And of course, each policy is a little bit different. Each one has variable requirements. And because research is increasingly collaborative, you've got most papers having multiple funders. Bruce did a great job of showing you how many that actually could be, with multiple sources of funding, multiple institutions, and often multiple countries. So if you think about the possible permutations, and my colleague David Crotty over at OUP would say the combinations of 880 variables are close enough to infinity that most calculators can't even figure it out. So I'm going to take David at his word that that would be true. So, well, how does Chorus get involved here? So Chorus is a community effort trying to reduce the burden of complying with public access mandates. So you can see in one of our little circles there, you've got all the publishers and service providers, and we're hoping that more of you will join us in that effort. But more importantly is the fact that the community is not just about the publishing community. It's all about funders also seeing that there's a problem out here and that they know that they need to improve. And so they want to work with the publishing community and also the institutions to improve this. And that's what Chorus is really about. But I said I'm a wonk, right? So I helped build some of this infrastructure, so I want to make sure that we use this infrastructure. So we help build this, and I want to use this to actually enhance the whole public access infrastructure. So how do we do that? Well, first off, I mean, this should not be a surprise to you because you all do this. You all submit information, what I call content DOIs, into Crossref. Alongside of that, you input funder IDs into what is actually no longer called FundRef, because Crossref renamed it. So it's actually part of their open funder registry, and that's what you actually should be mapping that all to. Once that happens, we can do some interesting things. So we can actually take that content DOI and check to see whether or not that article has actually been submitted into one of the dark archives, otherwise known as Clocks and Portico. So that's one thing we can do, and actually they give us that information back. Then we can also do more, right? So now if we have the content DOI and the funder ID, we can actually see whether or not either an author manuscript or a version of record has made its way onto one of the agency portals, because they have sprung up since 2013 and before that. So we have ways to track NSF and USGS and of course NIH and Department of Energy. Some of the agencies, very few of them, have given us a way to actually look up grant IDs within their systems. This is something I always talk to my agency partners about improving because they don't do enough of it. NSF is one of the ones that's the best. They actually do a really good job of that. Of course, ORCIDs. We've heard a lot about ORCIDs, right? So if we have an ORCID ID, or rather the content DOI, we can then figure out the ORCID ID as best as possible, and we do also absorb all of that. All of this goes into the metadata records that Chorus tracks for our member publishers. And the newest baby on the block for me is finally being able to connect up the content DOIs to their dataset DOIs, and we've been able to do that through the Scholix initiative. And Scholix then, in turn, connects up I have DataCite listed here, but it's a variety of different sources, Crossref being one, Pangaea being another, OpenAir being another. So in this one API to Scalex, I can find lots of really interesting data sets and report that back to the institutions, report that back to the funders, and they have found that to be particularly interesting. So what I was asked to talk about, though, is about why is getting metadata right critical for the funding community. So we really want to be able to identify the articles that are reporting on funded research. That's what we do. That's what the whole Open Funder Registry is all about. We also want to be able to disambiguate authors. This is key for the funding community. And as you've heard some of the other speakers talk, we really want to be able to properly credit contributions. So funders for their financial contributions, researchers for their work, and also a newer thing that I think, Bruce, you were talking about this morning, is that the research resources are also a thing, right? So it's not just about the grants, but what equipment did they use? What lab space did they use for their research? Did they use certain kind of samples, whether or not that's biological samples or geological samples? Did they use a particular ship to go on an oceanographic cruise? These are all actually pieces of the puzzle that make up research and actually can help solve some of the reusability stuff that we've been hearing about a lot, if you can be able to identify all of these things. And importantly, I always love following Copyright Clearance Center on this point, is to clearly indicate reuse rights, right? That was not true a few years ago, but it is starting to become much more true now. So the box is being opened considerably. So actually, I was very fortunate, and I wasn't sure I was going to get this, but I asked some of my colleagues over at the funding agencies whether or not they could supply me with some slides. You never know what you're going to get when you ask that kind of question. But actually, two of them responded. Department of Energy gave me this slide. So this verbatim, I didn't touch this slide at all. So you could see here that the Department of Energy has a division called OSTI, the Office of Science and Technology Information. They maintain something called eLink. Right? I'm not going to read this out to you, but eLink basically is a manuscript submission system. Okay? So after a grant has been given, they expect after 12 months an author to submit an author manuscript into the eLink system. Okay? In that system is lots of metadata that they're collecting. They're collecting the contract numbers, names of laboratories, DOE's got lots of those, research organizations, of course, funder names, because by the way, it's not just the DOE, right? There's multiple funding going on. One of the beautiful things about working at Chorus is that we can see, hey, this article and the research behind it was funded by the Department of Energy in the United States, but also it got NSF funding, and it might have gotten some funding from the Japan Science and Technology Group, whatever. All of this is populated via metadata. So, of course, they get information from Crossref, things like titles and authors, and they look up ORCID IDs as well, and publication dates and journal information. All of this, actually, they ingest and use for their systems. And they do use persistent identifiers like DOIs. So this is also their slide. And you can see here that they actually point all of this towards two of their, what I will call portals. One of which is osti.gov, okay, which I'm sure every single one of you has been there. And the other one, more likely you've heard of, is something called the Pages system. That is their public access repository. That is where they actually will point to an author manuscript or a version of record if you're a Chorus member. They'll point to those, and they'll actually hide their own versions. Or if they don't get it from a publisher through a link through Chorus, they'll actually ask the author and they will actually show it up on their site. Okay, but all of that is driven by the metadata. Okay, so the metadata has to be clean, the metadata has to be there and present for them to get it. Now NSF's a little different, okay? So NSF has a very integrated approach. One of the things you didn't hear me mention when I was talking about DOE is I didn't really mention too much about their grant system. Because that's the OSTI group and the DOE grant people are actually two separate groups. This shouldn't surprise you about our government, that they're different. NSF has actually done a really good job. When they thought about this, they said, no, we actually want this all to be integrated. So they are actually using Department of Energy technology for the display of information, and they call theirs PAR, or Public Access Repository. Okay? But what they have done is all the metadata that is collected first through their research.gov thing, that all of that is collected via research.gov, and then it connects up through, again, Chorus and Crossref and a variety of other input mechanisms, okay, into a really robust PAR system that allows them to, once again, display author manuscripts if they've collected it, but if they found it through Chorus, they will link to the version of record or the author manuscript found on the publisher's site. But this is all about metadata in the end. But let me talk about some of the things that I have seen over the last 4 years. I am not calling out any particular publisher's names because you're all guilty. So let's talk about persistent IDs in general. So DOIs and ORCIDs. Well, one of the most interesting things that I've discovered, and you know who you are in the room, you've been gathering up all of these DOIs, you've been gathering up all these ORCIDs, you've been making these authors, maybe even doing the cutting and pasting thing, and you've been gathering them through your manuscript tracking systems. ORCID's never seen them. Crossref's never seen them, but yet they sit in your production system. Awesome. That doesn't help anybody, folks. Okay, get them out of your system, right? Get them into the registrars where they belong. Do the right thing and authenticate them when you actually can, right? Publication dates. Well, yeah, where do I start? So publication dates are not standardized whatsoever, right? They're a mess. There are online dates, there are print dates, there are AM dates, there are VOR dates, version of record, sorry. We tried to use the Crossref data and actually tried to normalize that down to one date and say, yes, this is the publication date. We got burned so badly. So now what do? We list them all. We say, buyer beware, but this is everything that exists within Crossref that we're seeing, and you can decide what you want from it and decide what's right. It's tough. Publication dates need reworking. They need standardization. If people are involved in working groups, please focus on publication dates, because God knows, it needs work. ORCID IDs, right? Hey, I was a co-founder, right? I think they're really important. But honestly, because we list them within Chorus, and we have the little green logo, which I loved, right? There's about usually one per article. Who is that? That's the corresponding author. That's a good start, right? You got to start somewhere, but it's really got to be about every single author, right? And it's got to be authenticated, as Bruce rightly said. So there's a lot of work yet to be done, and I think we heard one of the speakers, I think it was yesterday, he was like, it's great that we have this ORCID thing, but there's just not enough of them. It's true, there's just not enough of them. And affiliations, well, this is the great open country as far as I'm concerned. Right? I know Christine, will talk about ISNIs and so forth, and that's fine, but there is truly no widely used open standard that everyone is really gravitating towards. There is no like ORCID or Crossref or anything like that for organizational IDs. There are very specific uses, commercial uses like Ringgold and so forth, but no one has really gravitated and said, this is the one. And there's a lot of work being done right now between Crossref and ORCID and some others, and I think 2019, that's going to be the year that we're going to break that, and we're going to have a watershed moment. I really do hope so. So keep that in mind, because I certainly will be looking for it, because gosh, it's got so much use. I got another page of these. So this is the last page of my comments. So article record changes. This is tough. We see it a lot. So yeah, generally around January. Articles will move from one publisher to another because maybe a society's gotten fed up with a publisher or whatever the reasons might be. Well, there's actually not really good recording of the transfer of journals from one to another. And this is a problem, and it breaks systems like mine all the time. Because there's no change flags about the fact that it just moved from commercial A to commercial B, or maybe it's been society A to society B, less likely, but it could happen. This is something that, downstream, we would like to have this information, because otherwise we have to build some logic to figure this out. Platform vendor changes. We ingest data every night, So in and around 2 months ago, one of the major publishers went live, right? Yay, on a platform. Everything that they had, every bit of metadata that they had about their author manuscripts broke, just gone. And our dashboards went, ooh. Okay. I mean, but this is a service that we offer, right? We have publisher dashboards, and this is sort of the reason for that is so that we can help you check your metadata, right? But gosh, when you do a platform change, it's great that your new data is going to be nice and pristine. Make sure your legacy data comes along with it, or at least keep it stable somehow until you're ready. Because boy, when you're downstream and you see that change happen, it's brutal. It is brutal. And then reuse licenses. This is a fairly recent development, so I cut all of you slack about this. But this is something that we help push because reuse licenses are near and dear to the heart of Chorus members. Very non-standardized use of start dates. This is kind of a problem. Some people start it, at the time of publication. Sometimes it's maybe about 2 months after that. It's almost arbitrary. So the start date thing is something that I know that the Crossref community is really starting to look at because as people are using this, and it's not just us, you have to think, how are they using this data, right? So if you've got a reuse license there and it's a CC BY and you say a start date, but yet it's on your site and the site already has CC BY on it, but yet the metadata is saying that it's 2 months from now, what's going on, right? Why is that happening? And this is all about clean metadata. So make sure, and this is important, it's not just the production people anymore, because now it's the business people who are setting the terms, and maybe you're not communicating that appropriately to the people that are doing the metadata. You got to make sure this is all right because, hey, lots of systems now, by the way, are absorbing this and ingesting this. Yeah, and then you could talk about open access and whether or not it's public access. We use those kind of interchangeably. It's mostly because the US government says public access, but you go to the Australians, they talk about open access. It's all about what can people get, when, and what can they do with it. So let's talk about Metadata 2020 a little bit. So Metadata 2020 is an initiative that started last year. It's all about helping to improve the quality of metadata for research. It is not a 501c3, it's nothing like that. It is a bunch of volunteers getting to say there's got to be a better way, right? There's just got to be a better way. So it's a collaboration, okay? And it's about 120 individuals. There are publishers, there are librarians, there are service providers like me, there are data publishers, repositories, it's across the board, okay? But they're saying there's got to be a better way to improve our metadata. And we talk about richer, connected, and reusable. Well, what does that mean? So richer metadata will fuel discoverability and innovation. That's important. The connectiveness will connect metadata bridges between different systems and different communities. And reusable, of course, right? You want the stuff to be reusable. You want it to be open metadata. Key word, open metadata. And eliminating the duplication of effort, right? That is key. And I was really happy to see that ORCID is really embracing that. And I think we should all embrace that. Input once, reuse many times. So the 2020 projects, because, hey, you got to have one of these kind of charts, right? Basically, if you look at this, I'm not going to talk to how they all interconnect and so forth, but we've got 6 major projects that are going on in 2018. So last year, it was all about formation and thinking it through. This year, it's all about the 6 projects. One is P1, as we call it, researcher communication. So that's a real outreach to the researcher, trying to explain to the researcher why this is important. 2 is metadata recommendations and evaluation mapping. So again, this is really important about how stuff maps to stuff. Determining 3 is defining the terms that we use about metadata. That is a fun group because how we all talk about metadata, I bet you most of the people in this room mostly talk about metadata the same way, but I've had lots of conversation with funders and labs, totally different ways of talking about metadata. So this is actually really important just to figure out how that goes. And then 4 is incentives for improving metadata quality. That's actually a large part of what this panel is all about. And then mine, and I'll put my hand up here because I'm actually one of the co-leads on it, is number 5, which is shared best practices and principles, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. And the last is P6, metadata evaluation and guidance. So a little shout out to my own. And Jennifer is actually in the room. She's my co-lead on this thing, or chairs. I don't know what we call ourselves. because remember, we're not an official organization, we're just a collaboration. So our purpose for this group is to build a set of high-level best practices for using metadata across the scholarly communications cycle in order to facilitate interoperability and easier exchange of information and data across the stakeholders in the process. So the first thing that we actually did is to just look across scholarly community and say, what are all the best practices that are out there, right? And we came up with quite a list, and eventually we'll be publishing said list of best practices with no judgment about what it is, but just these exist. And actually, some of that work is really helpful, and you can actually use them in your own work. And out of that, we plan to create some best practices for the overall initiative, as well as principles, because those go together. So let me impart with you 5 things that I think you could do, right? But you should think up your own, right? These are my 5, this is my 5 things that you can think about doing. Tag your funders, okay? But when you do it, you make sure you use the Crossref Funder ID system. Don't just make up the funders, right? There's a really, you can download the whole registry if you'd like from Crossref. There's an API to it. It's awesome. Use the Crossref Funder ID. Tag your authors. I learned something, but do it with authentication. Don't copy and paste, right? I took a note on that, Bruce. Use the ORCID IDs, right? That's really important. Grow it, okay? Tag affiliations. You know, I'm gonna put my hand up and say, we've chosen to use grid, right? You gotta start somewhere because there is no really embraced standard out there. But if you don't want to use grids, find another one, right? Use ISNI, use Ringgold if that's a service you bought into, because actually they will map to each other. But get it into there. Get it into your JATs. Post your article reuse policies. And then, by the way, make sure you register those at Crossref, okay? Because it's really important that people know what reuse policies you've ascribed to that article. And then the last one, remember I said 5. This one I've said before in many other pulpits. Recheck, and update your metadata at least once per year, right? I said this to Bruce, and he said, why once a year? I said, you got to give them a minimum, right? It could be more than that, but do it once a year. And that's it for me, so thanks.
Okay, thank you so much to everybody. 5 points from Howard, 5 speakers. This is all good. Maybe we'll have 5 questions. So I'm going to say we have Judy with a mic over here, and Yael, do we have any questions online yet from our virtual attendees? No? Okay, you never know. So anyone at all? There and there.
Hi, thanks. Is this on? Okay. Thanks, everyone, for a great presentation. I have a question, and it's sort of directed to Sarah, but everybody else jump in. With the notion of a metadata working group, you sort of brought this idea of cultural changes and cultural issues of metadata into the discussion here. So I'm curious how that working group got started. How difficult was it to sell that within your organization? I mean, I think everybody here understands the importance of metadata, but I think for a lot of people in the rest of the organizations where we all work, it's sort of a weird term. We've heard of it, but nobody really knows what it is or how to do it. How did you sort of sell that idea? And then also a more operational, who's on that working group? You know, not the individual people, but the kinds of people. Is it interdisciplinary, or is it sort of focused on one?
Right, and
That's
a good question that I left out of my presentation. First off, the people that make up our working group are across all departments. So that includes IT, publishing, product development, analytics, digital media. And I think that's a key part for the working group to actually work, because each department looks at metadata differently, they use it differently, and they have different needs. And so that when we put together the metadata working group, that was our first goal, was to make sure everyone was represented in the room. And then I forgot that second, the second question was about how we got buy-in from all different departments. So one of the first steps was we got together and created a list of the benefits for each department and each group. And as I mentioned, we thought it would just be 4 or 5, or that we'd be scraping by to get, enough benefits to get buy-in. But we ended up having about 21 different benefits, which translated into basically 20 different goals. So that made buy-in much easier, because then when we brought it to senior management to approve starting the working group, they could each see their department within the goals of the working group. So I'm not sure if that fully answered your question, but that's kind of how we did it.
Hi, Monica Muniz from Cameroon University Press. I had a couple of questions, but I'll stick to one. About open access, I think one of the problems, and this is a question, not just me thinking, is that people have different definitions of open access, still in publishing, but everywhere else. So can we maybe focus more on the license and less on open access? Because when people collect that metadata, they then label it as something as open access when it could be like green OA or something like that. So maybe that should be a require overall.
I agree. Actually, at Chorus anyway, we steer usually pretty clear of open access unless it's pushed on us, like by the Australians or something. But that's why we like public access, because actually it doesn't have any real meaning behind it. It just means, is it available to the public, right? Period. And when Chorus monitors for public access, we literally do that. Can our systems and can our people, and we don't subscribe to anything, sorry, can we access them? It's publicly accessible, that's it. And then, but then, the reuse license connected to that is really important. Just because I can access it doesn't mean I can necessarily reuse it. It just means I can access it. So we have to tie in, is there a reuse license here? And then where can you find that reuse license?
Just to add to that, from the CCC side, all of our permissioning services. So again, we're taking metadata in from our publishers, and if you can't tell us that an article or a piece of content, and maybe soon book content, is under a certain license and open access, then we can't present that data back correctly to our corporate customers, to publishers trying to reuse other publishers' content, and that becomes very problematic.
This is Kristen Martin from University of Chicago, and I was curious for institutional affiliation. I'm at the library, and we've been involved in a pilot project with ISNI identifiers, and I'm wondering if you see that as a potential to help with the institutional disambiguation issues.
I can speak to ISNI a little bit. Ringgold is the registration agency for ISNI in the organizational ID space that crosses into this space. An ISNI identifier, just to kind of back up, is it's a ISO standard. It's a bridge identifier. So what it carries is a unique 16-digit ID to uniquely identify that organization. And then there's a bunch of kind of name variants and some very limited metadata. It is designed per the ISO standard to be a bridging identifier to link you from, like for example, as Ringgold, we link into ISNI, so every, Ringgold organization with all of our, internal proprietary metadata links to that. And then if someone else is using ISNI, you can like hop from one to the other. Okay, so that's the function of ISNI. So it's a nice starting point, but it also has its limitations. But as Howard mentioned, there are other sources as well. For institutional, for affiliation specifically, there's a couple, a lot of people use Ringgold. Some people are starting to use ISNI. I'd actually like to talk to you about how that's going. That would be really interesting. Some people are utilizing Grid, which is another open source. For funders, people are using, again, it's the same organizations again and again sometimes, organizations that might be an affiliation of one author are also in the Open Funder Registry list. So, there are bridges there as well. So it depends kind of what you're doing. So,
And just to
take that too?
Can I supplement there? Because what can be super important in the open access world, and why I think a lot of our publishers use Ringgold because of its hierarchy. So let's say I'm an author, I come in through Aries editorial manager, I self-identify that I'm a part of the University of Chicago, I identify that I'm a part of the chemistry department. We can fire a rule that says, oh, this person's a child of the University of Chicago, publisher A has a relationship with the University of Chicago. Yes, this author from this department is eligible for that discount, that affiliation discount, that relationship, whatever it might be. And so the hierarchy can be super useful so that you don't have to map necessarily thousands of discount levels, right? You can map at an organizational level, at whatever organizational level that relationship exists at. So that can be a very specific use case in an open access world, but I think there's a lot of value in the identifiers having the hierarchies. Is it at a consortia level? Is it at a university level? Is it at a department level?
I think it's like a pick the right tool for the job kind of thing. So depending on what are you trying to do, why do you want that affiliation? You know, is it something more complex where a hierarchy is needed, or really are you just trying to disambiguate one for the other? Maybe a different tool is fine too. So it depends what's your end goal, why you're trying to get that affiliation. So. Okay. 2 questions over here. Oh yeah, so far.
Hi, Emily Marchant from Cambridge University Press as well. Jennifer, I think you emphasised the importance of the why when talking to researchers specifically, and Howard, one of the projects from Metadata 2020 is also focusing on that. I was wondering, with the difficulty of how much we ask researchers to do for us and how much we try to communicate to them, what have you or any of the other panelists learned about successful ways of emphasizing the importance of this?
I think it's really hard because I think we all know that authors don't read a lot of help text and instructional information unless they run into a problem, right? That's what our usability says. But maybe as all of the vendors and platforms, we have to think about redesigning how we do the messaging. Maybe we have to gate things a little bit more, but I think emphasizing the messaging in as many places as you can, on your own website, in the submission system, in a RightsLink workflow, in the emails that you send to them, in the videos we present, and I think engaging the university community. So I was at the Research Steward Reader Conference in February, March in London, and it was so clear how little so many of the institutions understand about the submission systems. What do my researchers go through? Why are you asking for all of this data? And when you start explaining it back, then they're like, oh, I get it. And then can you gate it a little bit more? Well, sometimes we can, but sometimes we can't, because again, we're trying to make an APC workflow author-centric, or we're trying to make something else author-centric, and if you just give us a little bit more data, everything else is going to be much easier for you downstream.
Yeah. Yeah. And then Howard.
I just want to add one really quick comment. I think it was Evan Owens, who's in the room, made the comment a few years ago when he was at American Institute of Physics that literally on the screen in the submission system where funding information was being collected, they had to add one simple sentence: please make sure the funding information you're adding here matches what's in your acknowledgement paragraph, and both the completion and quality of completed metadata collected shot way up. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's as simple as one clarifying sentence as to what your expectation is. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Devin's nodding his head yes, so I didn't mistranslate.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm going to say I'm really happy that I'm not the lead of that particular project, because I think that's actually the toughest one. Mm-hmm. But watch that space on Metadata 2020. Hopefully there'll be some really good outputs and some advice that we can all give to our constituencies, right, about why this is important to them. But my opinion is you got to make it personal. You got to say why it's important to you as a researcher. You know, and funders can do that. Labs can do that. Publishers, we have influence too, so we can do it too. But watch the Metadata 2020 space, because that's exactly what that project's about.
Yeah, that is a tough one. I think, yeah, what's in it for them is it's about discoverability. It's about, can someone find this article that you worked so hard on? You know, I think that's a component. Just asking, oh, because we want it for our own purposes as publishers, they don't care, and that's fine if they don't care. But yeah, how can we position it so that there's a value in it for them, and they'll spend an extra moment or two to give us the information that we need to make a workflow function, to make their content more discoverable. So I see we're just about
trial and error
at
too.
time. We got one more, time for one more? Perfect.
Hi, Tara Kelly, Science Journal AAAS. Great talk, everyone. I just wanted to ask about metadata validation tools and what might be suggested by anyone on the panel. We have run into issues where we're collecting metadata, but the downstream can't use it, or they're not using it yet. We've also run into instances where we have valid XML. It validates perfectly. It's beautiful, and when we try to downstream it to Crossref, it's rejected because there's a duplicate ORCID, or there's a DOI tag that's empty, or something like that. So I'm wondering if there's any suggestions from the panel.
Mary, we could take this one together and just say one word, which is schematron. Any of you who are creating XML and you don't have a schematron validation layer above it, you should have that. If you don't know what that is, come see us after class. We'll be more than happy to explain it to you. The other thing I always like to tell people is if you're using a vendor, you can outsource your work, you can have it done for you, but you can never outsource your quality assurance. And so you need to take responsibility for doing your own QA, whether that's investing in building your own tools, whether it's bringing in a third party to build tools for you, and there are companies that can do that. But that's part of it. The other thing I'll just quickly add is anytime you've got two sources for data that you can compare, as I gave in my talk the example of the author list in the transmittal and the author list in the manuscript, build an automated system to try to compare them to make sure that things are in fact right. Anyone else? No, you did a great job.
Great. Well, guys, I think we're at time, and just to wrap up, we saw metadata compared to the spice cabinet. It's the fuel that makes the automated systems go. Anyway, there was one more in there. It's the DNA that makes all this work. Well, I'll say for myself and all the other persistent identifier and metadata wonks up here, we're in love with this stuff. And metadata, this is someone else's line I'm cribbing. It's a love note to the future. It's a love note to future stakeholders. It's a love note to future researchers. So I hope we've encouraged you to kind of examine your own metadata systems and policies and start embedding it as much and as often as you can. So thank you so much, and we'll be here for questions for a few minutes if anyone has anything else. But thank you for spending some time with us today.